soon as it loads here.
It's pronounced small fair.
Yeah. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the reintroduction of Baobab press titles from Spring 21. We have Jesse DeLong reading from the Amateur Scientist Notebook, Tiffany Cates reading from M Theory, and Colin Rafferty reading from Execute the Office Essays with Presidents. I'd like to thank Small Fair for having us, Jesse Bender and her crew, and all of those guys for doing the work. I'm sure it's been a crazy, difficult time organizing everybody for this, what's been a bunch of awesome events. And thank you all for joining us out there. I'm in Reno, Nevada at Baobab Press's offices in Sundance Books and Music. We're going to start off with Jesse DeLong, who will be reading from Amateur Scientist Notebook. Jesse DeLong teaches composition and literature at Louisiana State University, but he grew up in northern Idaho and western Montana. He holds a BA in English from the University of Montana and an MFA in poetry from the University of Alabama. His poems have appeared in the anthologies Best New Poets 2011 and Feast, Poetry and Recipes for a Full Seating at Dinner, as well as the journals Colorado Review, Mid-American Review, Indiana Review, Painted Bride Quarterly, and Typo. With book artist Sonia G. Rosso, he has published several artist books and chapbooks, including Tearings and Other Poems and Earthwords, both through Curly Head Press. Other than traditional academic settings, he has taught literature at Donaldson Correctional Facility and has worked as a case manager at a reentry services center, teaching hard and soft skill courses such as anger management and parenting to parolees and probationers. Very excited to hear Jesse read. He'll take it away.
Hey, everybody. Thanks to Sundance Books and Music for hosting us, and thanks to Colin and Tiffany for reading with me. I'm going to read from the Amateur Scientist Notebook. This first poem, Florets, and then the other floret poem I'm going to read. One thing that's happening during the poem is the speaker is continuously interrupting himself, and so he'll interrupt himself, and then he'll go back to his line of thought. So if you hear those sort of breaks, that's what those are. So, florets. 1. This is in 4 parts. The struggle of scale begins in a sunflower. Floret, sharp of petals, stem bright, it starts to fill air, to feed earth, to forge from root to flower, the color and coarseness of its borders, while around sprouts the collage of a larger order. Feathers, flora. Bird, I light a lamp, wick submitted to kerosene, a horizon of dust furrows. Restless, I withhold any offerings as you settle into the sofa, a sunflower plucked and lain on pink clovers. Phosphorus, water and light, a sunflower bound of small flowers blooming in the sun. What is one is once lost, torn, once lost in one, empties into soil. Bird, you inherit such gestures, sand releasing its shape to water, a cloud bruising in leaflets of rain, into the toil of root fibers curling around a mid-rib cage, minerals measuring the level of our difference, a chrysanthemum-colored bee, a drone carrying no spores, no stinger, no home. Light absorption on a leaf, simply split, the strewn can be supported by the order. Feathers, flora. A lamp sprouts through the air. Slowly you rise. You are the bulb I was born to close my eyes to. I try to touch your arm, but you are already in the bathroom. In the mirror, I memorize you, massaging soap on your fingers. Or to say our ozone is one big lungful of air where particles of leaf glitter in clay collide in the fringes of tissue. 2. Tissues of song, of sinew, wind, and root. 3. Sallow as moth wings, I stare. Clouds rattle the sky, like dust in a furnace. Nothing is perfect. I spent the morning sorting through every door you'd entered. Feeling powder fluttering in my chest, I step outside where you are reading Haibun under the house's shade, and grass is muttering a language too green for glare. The chrysanthemums keep sunlight in little boxes on their petals. What is the contour taken in the brain when restlessness finally subsides? You set the book aside and sleep with a hat over your eyes. The sunflowers begin to napkin up the light, rice paper between my fingers. Vapors unsoil, centers rough as wrist lines. I delicately rotate their bodies, careful not to tremble, wary even of my own breath. 4. For those sunflowers of May, clarity strikes everything a petal or stem displays, a revelation by route of pigmentation, or the scriptures of shade composed in vain on undergrowth. Thousands of florets. I light a fire beside the river to crave the shade your face keeps. The sky tarnished in smoke, flames and ash. When you grace the bank, lungs lit, water drumming a tuned blood nose, I announce the night, our God, no wind, no, the moment, no moment. So tiny they squander intricacy on light cherished, smoldering, gold with transparency, canvassing petal centers and the borderlines of hunger. Everything the soil supports is foreseen in seed. The land laying out before summer like an exhalation, a single floret of smoke points onward. Newton and the law of grave eating. Picture Newton as an older boy, almost a man. This would be during some summer at his family's farm in Woolsthorpe. While he was digging an irrigation ditch, he noticed a girl amble up the road, holding a parcel of letters and a package wrapped in brown paper. When she neared him, she rested beside 3 makeshift graves. The headstones were crossed with poplar limbs, the joints strengthened with twine. From the paper, the girl unwrapped an apple. As Isaac strained under the meeting strength of shovel and earth, he watched her eat the fruit to its core. When she finished, she allowed their eyes to meet and placed the core on top of the graves and continued up the road. A few days later, Newton wandered under an oak tree, brooding over this equation. How a person, say a girl, can be propelled by her own force of duty like a stone thrown across the field, and how, at the same time, she can be lured by another, say a young ditch digger, the way the rock eventually falls to grass. If the force she is lured to, Isaac thought, is stronger than the force she is propelled from, then like the rock, she will get caught up by grave eating. Though, if the force the girl propels toward carries forward in her mind, while at the same time the force she is attracted to continues diverting her, then she will carry both forwards and downwards, both away from him and towards him, suspended in perpetual, bewildering motion. Floret as water. Crisp in the lungs, autumn then is a breath held. Stems begin to brittle, birds forage for seeds, coyote bones, white waste on the river's red bank. Broadcast lost in snow, we drive the interstate where time is suspended between long purple shadows and morning when the birds bleat. Sleeping, and the warmth of your breath gathers on glass. When I stir, you smile, staring to where fronds of headlights are guiding us home. The gap between pure white and pure black, the axis our bodies rotate. When I turn, your eyes are closed. Scribbled in fog is the word we. What is a bone bleached in river light if I am always restless and restless enough to scavenge? A chickadee sings somewhere in the snow-covered trees, its voice a whistle and whistles echo, the moth dead on the windowsill for days. for those who tire to scrape throats through frost. Snow sloshes the lawn, pebbles, mud, and ice chunks. A sparrow docks on the fence post, ruffles water from wings. Ah, the sun again. I light near the snow globe you gifted me during a softer winter. The glass is chipped and eclipses a ring on the windowsill's dry wood. In stained fingers, sky mirrors on the crest of the globe, clouds swell. The bird shadows its wings upside down in departure. Dusk in a tree, slowly, slowly. The sky an ice-stilled atom where a brown bat squeals, ultrasonic in the cooling air. I want to pronounce the distance, rattle the triple point where space and time collides, materials of lung and liver etched in this layer, where one is one and once lost in one, where one is once here and there, the imprint our bodies make on autumn and after. Past the globe, land emerges in chalk lines, a spine of hills narrowing to knuckles, ridges sharpened where the sky has lit its paper ends. If only our rituals really nourished us. Near the river dawn, I tender, as if anything more, the coyote rib. Morning slates on pebbles, the current disassembles the sun. Road lights, the only sound in the room. The curtains could be the northern lights, the carpet a tar pit. This is the void I willingly enter every day. I cross my arms, rest my hands at my shoulders, fingers spread. I take a step back, a step forward, a step back and to the side. Some ants march from a fallen tree to where an apple core browns on weeds. The hunger goes on and on like this, an animal knowing from which flares of love you feed. On air and angels, the reconciliation of twos. With the sound of a clapping, no, more than a sound, the sensation of the sound in his brain, Dunn woke. The air smelled of leaf smoke drifting through rain. Silence candlelit the room. Dunn kicked his sheets aside and walked to his desk where one wick burned low. From the bed, Anna mumbled some dream stumbling from her lips. But did he see her at first? The mole on her back, a bloated cross, where her spine nodded, the water-worn pages of a book, the Bible maybe? No. First he thought not of her, but of who she was as an idea, born to someone higher than himself, the daughter of a politician. No matter what he wrote on God, 1 + 1 would never equal, as he wanted it to, 1. Metaphysicians, like himself, believed not in twos, as he was confronted with, but threes, some celestial, aerial, and material, some God, angel, and us others, some infinite, some temporary, and the angels, thank goodness, in between, those gracious things, for reconciliation. If only, Anna, I could find a way. She turned so that the flesh of her shoulders shone, her neck where the hair allowed halos of skin. What could he get from this body other than what he'd already had? Though what more did he want than to hunger for it, as her skin wrinkled, as flesh gave over to shadows, his cravings, a generation seeding itself repeatedly through muscle and bone. And this is the last poem I'm going to read. It's the last poem in the book, Array. For light to hold or after. For light, silhouettes of striking to clasp on to us, hulls who can't carry it. Or after. What dusk does when the curtains close. Let's renew ourselves there, that paper season of behavior, you and me husk to one another, particles of what the day likes to combust, you and me beaming under affairs of damage. DNA disturbed in a sun splotch, carry forward, if you would, the bright wreckage of us. The street, papered in yesterday's parade of blossoms, rouses you, sleep deprived but battered by morning, to the pavement wet wrap of humidity the porch lamp left on. How many of us are useless by noon? Pupils narrowing, you turn to me and speak, no. Let's renew ourselves where our bodies eclipse last night's moonless emissions, a sort of ring of time never met by light, so that at that hour, any hour of dark, we appeared different, not a shadow, but what a shadow swallows. Why else, but at this moment of blindness, would I mold the contours of my sweat to yours? If a bat, wings of stretched, veiny flesh, were to ruck up what tiny particles of appearance somehow endured the day, it could not even perceive with those burrow-born eyes that separate heat sources disrupted its sonar. Isn't that what love is? Us hungering for an indistinguishable presence in a world we will never navigate? Or is it, while still in the bat's ricochet mapping of a half-light, to suddenly separate from who we drew our warmth for, animals confronting our own sensory competence, whether we even believe the sun is 8 light minutes from Earth? Thanks, everyone.
Good job, Jesse. That was awesome. Much appreciated. Thank you. We're going to pivot now to Colin Rafferty. We have Tiffany Cates on deck too, but she's out in Portland and she's having some issues with her internet. So hopefully we get her back. I should also say that this is the second of 3 small fair events that Baobab Press is doing this week. The next will be on March 24th at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, and that's with Felicity Muth and Alex Lindauer, the authors of Am I Even a Bee, who will be talking about their vocations in science and the arts, which should be good. So tune in on Sundance Books and Music's YouTube channel for that, where you can also find our event that we did on Sunday with our Spring 21 authors, as well as all of Baobab Press and Sundance Books and Music's events. So check that out. So without further ado, we're going to jump into Colin Rafferty. Colin was born in Kansas City, Missouri, where he grew up on the Kansas side, which makes a difference. In 3rd grade, he unhesitatingly told an autograph dealer that the label on a Lincoln autograph was wrong. He was 16th president, not 17th. Later, Rafferty attended land-grant universities and eventually got an MFA from the University of Alabama. He writes about monuments and memorials, presidents, and more generally, public and private histories. In doing research for Execute the Office, he visited the graves of 28 presidents, toured the homes of another 16, and for reasons that he still doesn't understand, was allowed to handle a 4-page letter written by George Washington, the man himself. Rafferty has taught nonfiction writing at the University of Mary Washington since 2008, developing classes on nonfiction of place, the lyric essay, and writing for multimedia. Since 2012, he has lived in Richmond, Virginia with his wife, Elizabeth, and their dog in the same neighborhood where Patrick Henry gave the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech in the presence of 2 future presidents. So he is surrounded by history. Everybody out there digitally, welcome Colin Rafferty.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks to Small Fair and to everybody at Baobab for setting this up. It's really good to see. Am I on screen? It looks like. Trying to see. Sorry. Love some. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So okay, hey, it's great to be here. I'm very excited about the chance to bring all 3 of these books back. I was thinking that publishing a book last year felt a little bit like a story I once heard Ken Jennings tell about how he was on Jeopardy so long as the champion that his episodes started airing while he was still taping more episodes. And so people would come in, like the new contestants would come in and see him on stage and just go like, oh no. And I think in this metaphor, obviously, Ken Jennings is the pandemic and then our books are the 2nd and 3rd contestants on Jeopardy. It's not the best metaphor, but it feels honest to me. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for setting this up. It's a really kind of wonderful chance to set something up. I'm going to read. So the book is Execute the Office: Essays with Presidents. It is a collection of 45 essays, one for one for each president, although since we published, the book went to press right before the election, the 45th essay is essentially a Mad Lib for the author, or for the reader to fill in with their own understanding. We'll get around to a Biden essay one of these days. I'm going to read, I think, 3 of them. I'm going to start with the Richard Nixon essay, as you might expect, because I was saying it feels a little bit like a kind of skeleton key to the whole book. A lot of the questions of that I ask a lot in the book are really contained in this essay. The book is, each president is introduced by kind of their relationship to 3 dates in American history that feel crucial for the presidency, right? One is the ratification of the Constitution. The second is the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then the third is the resignation of the office by Richard Nixon, right? The only time that's happened. So this is an essay that was originally titled 18 and a half, and then at editorial suggestion was changed to the much more exciting expletive deleted. So Richard Nixon, 37th President of the United States, 1969 to 1974, 182 years since the Constitution, 103 years since emancipation, resigned the office in 1974. 1. For a year and 7 months, after Truman dies in December 1972 and LBJ follows in January 1973, but before Gerald Ford assumes the office in August 1974, Richard Nixon is the only living president. He is the only person who knows what the awesome power and responsibilities of the office entail, the only person who knows what it's like to hold the highest office in the land. In those 19 months, there are 12 men who know what it's like to walk on the surface of the moon, and 1 man who knows what it's like to sit in the Oval Office as commander-in-chief. 2. Here is a man already prone to feeling left out, who had started his own club, the Orthogonians, at Whittier College when the Franklins, the established club, would not let him join, who is now more isolated than at any time previous. Here is a man whose downfall comes at his own hands, at his insistence on recording every conversation, every rant, every private discussion of matters big and small in his office. 3. Perhaps as much as he is a man defined by his recordings, he is a man defined by gaps. The constant expletive deleted in the tape transcripts, the 18.5-minute gap in the Watergate tapes that is supposedly an accidental erasure by his secretary, stretched out to answer the phone and whose contents have puzzled historians for 2 generations. The gap of his unfinished presidency filled by Ford, a man who became president by virtue of Nixon's choice. 4. I was born in the bicentennial year, in the wake of the resignation. During my entire childhood, no president died, and then the month I graduated from high school, Nixon died. I remember the platitudes, the praise for his foreign policy triumphs. In the papers, the photo of him on Air Force One in China, arriving to meet with Mao. He was the president to begin the removal of American troops from Vietnam. 5. Some remember him that way. Some remember him as the disgraced former president, the only one to resign the office, who conducted secret wars and who more than likely approved dirty tricks to secure his reelection. They remember that before he removed the troops from Vietnam, securing a peace with honor, his signature was on several thousand condolence letters to families across the country. 6. How do presidents get remembered? How do they move into our national memory? How does the memory get set, if it ever does? How do we isolate them into the story that we tell, that becomes the history by which we understand ourselves? If there's no one else who knows what it's like to bear the weight of the job, then how did Nixon understand the presidency? How could he understand it? 7. He had it written on his own tombstone. The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker, which he had said in his first inaugural address. 8. That 18.5-minute gap, the one that Rosemary Wood said she'd caused accidentally while stretching to answer the phone, no one knows what was on it. The gap is in the middle of a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. Nixon said he didn't remember what they discussed. Haldeman's notes mentioned they discussed the break-in at the Watergate complex. 9. Does that history matter? The tapes from 3 days later weren't erased, and their contents, once made public, were enough to make the remaining support for Nixon vanish. He resigned a few days later. 10. Haldeman's successor, Alexander Haig, said that a sinister force was responsible for the erasure. Maybe history is the sinister force, erasing Nixon to either foreign policy genius or disgraced resigned president. 11. There are so many ways that the story of Richard Nixon should be a shining example of the American spirit. His father ran a gas station and grocery store in Yorba Linda, California, the opposite of the Tony upbringing of Kennedy. Nixon wanted to play football in both high school and college despite his small stature, and did, technically, as a rarely used substitute more known for his cheering than for his playing time. He left California for Duke Law School all the way across the country and rose to be elected the president of its bar association, graduating third in his class. He served in the Navy in World War II and then started his political career with a series of wins, first a representative, then a senator, then Ike's vice president before he lost the presidency to Kennedy by a thin margin in 1960 and then lost the California governor's race in 1962. 12. Those are stories history tells us, the debates on television and his 5 o'clock shadow dooming him while the golden Kennedy shines, him stating, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore" to the press after the loss in 62. 13. It would be easy to count him out then, but he returns in 1968 and wins, and then buries McGovern in a landslide in 1972. This is the kind of story we love in America. The idea that anyone, even a grocer's son from small town California, can become president, can face the odds again and again, can make sacrifices, can stand up to his defeats to come back swinging and win. 14. Deep Throat told the journalist the White House tapes had been manipulated. He was standing in a parking garage in Northern Virginia that was supposed to be torn down, erased from the landscape in 2017, and yet still stands, mute witness. 15. Which Nixon do we walk into history with? Depends on who's telling the story and to whom and when. It is possible that we're so close to this history that we can't hold on to all of it. When I think of LBJ, I think of a man in black and white. And when I think of Nixon, I think of a man in color. 16. The first time I left the country, I went to Beijing. I was able to visit China in large part because Nixon had gone to China before I was born and changed the relationship between the two countries in ways that have rippled far out into today and will continue into tomorrow. Our tour guide took us to one of the approved restaurants for tourists to get Peking duck, and on the wall was a photograph of Nixon in that restaurant. Not him in the triumph of 1972, but during his return visit in retirement in 1985. He was an old man in that photo, old in a way that I had never thought of him. 17. How will we remember today in 50 years? As a sinister force? As a triumph of foreign policy? 18. Nixon's tombstone is black granite. It says that the greatest title history can bestow is peacemaker, but it leaves us to determine if Nixon received that title. 18 and a half. Note to self, redact the unimportant parts. So that's the Nixon essay. I'm going to jump back because I come to you live from Richmond, Virginia, and on my block, the cherry trees have blossomed this week. They are lovely and delightful. And so that, of course, puts me in mind of William Howard Taft, because the cherry blossoms in DC are the result of William Howard Taft and actually more his wife, Helen Taft, and their relationship with Japan that brought them over here. So this is the William Howard Taft essay. It's called Judgment. William H. Taft, 27th President of the United States, 1909 to 1913, 122 years since the Constitution, 46 years since emancipation, 61 years until the resignation. Bench. On days that opinions are announced by the court from the bench, the text of each opinion is made available immediately to the public and press in a printed form called a bench opinion. From Information About Opinions, supremecourt.gov. If you know anything about William Howard Taft, it's probably his weight. He did get stuck in the White House bathtub. That's not a legend. Maybe you know the story that his presidency so disappointed Theodore Roosevelt, his mentor, who had chosen him as his successor, that Roosevelt ran against him in the next election. Maybe you know that he joined the Supreme Court after the presidency, but that already feels like pushing the boundaries of common knowledge. Slip. Several days after an opinion is announced by the court, it is printed in a 6x9 self-cover pamphlet called a slip opinion. In case of the discrepancies between the bench and slip opinions, the slip opinion controls. From Information About Opinions. He was a man with a legal mind, and his early days show a man setting himself toward the bench. Attended Yale, Skull and Bones, Linonian Society, secrecy and debate. He wrestled too, as big men often do, and as big men often do, he understood how his body worked. He could dance, could negotiate spaces around him, power and grace, that sort of thing. And the career moves steadily forward. Judge of the Superior Court of Cincinnati, then the Harrison administration's Solicitor General, the youngest ever at just 32 years old, the lawyer who stands in front of the Supreme Court on the government's behalf in the chambers of Congress, where the court meets as it has no home of its own. Then the Court of Appeals and professor of constitutional law at Cincinnati. He is moving up. He is an Ohio Republican when being an Ohio Republican means entry into the halls of power. It's not fair, our reduction of him, but how else do we judge a man? The complexity of the question is impossible, like trying to imagine how a man might fall upwards. Preliminary print. The preliminary prints of the US reports are the third generation of opinion publication and dissemination. These are brown self-cover advance pamphlets that contain, in addition to the opinions themselves, all of the announcements, tables, indices, and other features that make up the US report. In case of discrepancies between the slip opinion and preliminary print version of a case, the preliminary print controls from information about opinions. What changes our minds? How do we form opinions? How do we decide? President McKinley, an Ohio Republican, asked Taft to govern the new American territory of the Philippines, to leave the judgment of the law to foster its execution. Taft had opposed annexation, and McKinley knows his ambition is for the Supreme Court, but Taft says yes. His commitment to his decision is such that when, 3 years later, Roosevelt offers him an associate justice seat on the court, Taft turns it down, because in his opinion, the Philippines cannot yet govern themselves. Ambitions at play. Roosevelt, who sees Taft as a trusted figure, one he named Secretary of War and grooms for the presidency. Helen Taft, politically ambitious in a time when women cannot vote, who pushes her husband further into politics. And Taft himself, who knows that what he really wants is not any seat on the Supreme Court, but the seat on the court. He is aimed for Chief Justice, and he will find his way there somehow. He runs for president reluctantly, but how can he say no to Roosevelt when he could not say no to McKinley? He is the party's available man. But as president, he falters. He cannot charm the press or the public as Roosevelt could do so masterfully. Devotion to the law and precedent makes being a progressive difficult. Yet he files antitrust lawsuits and submits the first modern presidential budget. He is president when a constitutional amendment creates the federal income tax. He makes changes that endure. Not enough. His friend Roosevelt turns on him, forming a third party, and the vote is split, and the Democrat Wilson, a Southerner relocated to New Jersey, becomes president. So he's done. We can close the books on him. Starting in 1948, surveys of both historians and the public rank him near the middle, not good, not bad, impartial. He leaves, loses weight, stress and worry make a man eat, and we can suppose that's all. Then in 1921, Edward Douglas White, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, dies. The president, Warren G. Harding, is an Ohio Republican. Bound. The fourth and final generation of opinion publication is the case-bound set of law books entitled United States Reports. The opinions and other materials contained in the preliminary prints are republished in this series of books. In the case of discrepancies between the preliminary print and bound volume versions of a case, the bound volume controls from information about opinions. Justice Frankfurter tells Justice Brandeis that he cannot understand why a man who is so good as Chief Justice could have been so bad as president. But we can speculate, can talk about a devotion to law, an ambitious wife, an overpowering boss, a tendency to say yes when he should say no, a tendency to say no when he should say yes, and maybe generously, a foresight to see a winding path to his ultimate goal. After all, he was the one who appointed the aged White to the Chief Justice's seat. He understood legacy. In 1929, as Chief Justice, he convinces Congress to build the court its own home, a permanent building for the bench. As a young man, he stood on one side. A presidency later, he sat on the other. There is one room in which the Supreme Court has met since Taft's building was dedicated 5 years after he died, and it is where the 20th century was shaped, where the 21st century is being shaped. There is one bench and 9 seats, one podium from which every case is argued. Brown versus Board, Roe versus Wade, Bush versus Gore, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, Obergefell versus Hodges, all of them spoken and argued and judged in a space made possible by Taft, a man who found a way for a former president to surpass his office. So I'll call it a day with that. Thanks again. I really appreciate everybody coming out for this, and thanks again to Small Fair and Baobab for setting it up.
Thank you, Colin. Awesome as always. I think we got Tiffany back on board here, which is great. The satellites are coming through in Oregon once again, which is always a good thing. I should also mention that these books are and have been available from your local independent bookstore. So go pick up a copy or wherever you buy your books. And we'll jump into Tiffany and M Theory. Tiffany Cates spent 5 years navigating Chicago's transit and weather systems before moving to Oregon and earning her MFA in creative writing from Oregon State University. Strongly influenced by her degrees in philosophy and psychology, Cates writes around themes of personhood, the distance between self and other, and matters of free will. She is the founding editor of Townsend, a literary journal devoted to long-form fiction writers, and she currently lives in Corvallis, Oregon. Here's Tiffany Cates writing from her outstanding novel, M Theory.
Hello, and thanks for organizing this. I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm just going to jump right in and go with the first chapter here. This is M Theory, and the title chapter is The Lady in the Blue Coat. Running late rarely happened, but there were sure signs when it did. The woman who wore heels in ice and snow, the father who allowed his daughter to hit him when he told
So I think that we might be having technical difficulties with Tiffany. She's frozen on us here. We need one of those Muzak moments with the theme songs chiming in. We'll see if she comes through here. Nope, we lost her. Okay, well, hopefully she'll jump back in, but I think that that's like the second or third time we lost her, so she might be down for the count. So our apologies there, and our apologies to Tiffany, because that's a bummer. Her book is quite outstanding, M Theory. I really recommend picking up a copy if you have not already. And we'll see maybe if we can fit her back in for another event later this week, once we get the internet stuff figured out. I spoke to you soon on the radars in Oregon, apparently. So we'll just jump right into some Q&A. We have one question, wondering where Jesse acquired his sunflower shirt, and if that is...
Oh man, I got this sunflower shirt not very long ago, and I still can't remember where I got it. I think that Keosha's my fiance. I think that she bought it for me when I was doing some of these readings when the book first came out. I can't remember where she got it, but I do like it, and I do wear it around like for regular events too. So whoever is jealous of my shirt, thank you, because I do like this shirt too. So.
Well, and Colin is always dressed very dapperly for these events as well. So
yeah, I was thinking that me and Colin couldn't be dressed more thematically appropriate for our readings, right?
My big regret is that the screen is never big enough to show off the Kennedy and Johnson campaign button I'm wearing. So.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you were reading earlier. I was trying to think, like, well, I couldn't see what that pin said.
I need to get the Smithsonian has a big collection of campaign buttons, and some of them are like dinner plate size. I need to get one of those and wear them. A lot better for Zoom.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, wardrobe aside, something we are having y'all chew on a little bit was, part of Baobab's mission, and what we're looking for and the question we get regularly is, what do we mean by we like risk, we like invention? And I thought that this would be a great chance to, sort of field those questions, having, a poet, a nonfiction, and we did have a novelist there for a moment. And all of y'all are doing different things, that I wouldn't say that are sort of skewing from traditional. So what does that mean to you? I mean, when someone is there, how do you see risk involved in your writing and your work?
I can talk a little bit about that. In a way, there's sort of zero risk, or if there's risk in writing about the presidents, it's not that you're on untrod ground, but that, like, what could I possibly have to say that's new about the presidents? If you the end of the Ford's Theater room where Lincoln died tours actually has a huge spiral staircase that goes down, and in the middle of that spiral staircase are just stacks and stacks of books about Lincoln, about one president. And so with this project, the risk felt not of like I'm doing something no one's ever done before, but rather like I am trying to do this thing that has been done a million times, right? Tell the stories of the presidents in a way that felt different from standard biography, right? Trying to merge the lyric essay and American history into something that was a hybrid of the two. And so often I just kind of started writing the essays almost as a kind of experiment of just like, well, what would happen if I wrote lyric essays that were fact checkable and not memoir based? And did the first couple of presidents, and not even the first couple of presidents. It sounds like I started with Washington. I started with McKinley because that felt safe to start there, as opposed to a president that people know anything about. And I just kind of built from there. And after about 6 or 7, I was like, there might be something to these, and just kept digging around. And the risk of it, I think, came from trying to figure out how to keep doing the project in new ways with each essay, and find a structure or a voice or something like that for them.
Well, Colin, if I could jump in there, one thing that sort of struck me as I was reading your book, and I noticed is a lot of time, each of your entries sort of like each president had its own sort of like guiding metaphor for how you would approach it. So like, for example, Washington sort of as dance, Kennedy as pain, Nixon as sort of like erasures or gaps, Trump as naming, of course. So I was sort of really liked how each sort of entry that you had sort of that own focus or lens to how you sort of went about doing that. Could you tell us sort of about how you decide? Did these come up naturally? Did they come sort of organically, or? Yeah,
a lot of it was just kind of, some stuff just kind of felt like it fit in a particular way. I think with one of the forms in the piece is about, or in the book is that there's a movie script for Ronald Reagan. And that felt like a way to kind of talk about visual representation of the presidency. And so some kind of fit that way. With others, the ideas behind them emerged more in the writing. There's, especially with Washington, one of the challenges was like, how do I find anything new to say about this incredibly well-known figure? And to kind of land on the humanness of him enjoying dancing was like, okay, there's that moment of human recognition there. And that was a way in. I think one thing I'm kind of curious about with your book is the structure of like how you kind of create a sense of progression through the book without that through line of narrative, right? And how do you did that, maybe this is just kind of, I had a built-in order with my book where it was like, start with Washington and end with whoever number 45 is, and then. But for you, how do you put it together? And does that feel like a element of things?
Yeah, I mean, each book, I think of books as in terms of as like projects. So each project has its own sort of like guiding way that comes about it through writing. A lot of this one came up through the drafting process, but basically sort of like the order that I had hoped to achieve in this book was sort of like the order of the sunflower. So the sunflower is the cover of the book. I'm wearing the sunflower shirt. They're all the poems that are called florets, and basically the idea behind the sunflower is a big flower that is made up of also individual flowers, and each of those sort of individual flowers are their own unit, and they're their own sort of value and worth in themselves, but then they also sort of make up the whole of the larger flower. And so that's sort of what I had hoped to do, sort of not only with the poems, but even with the poems within the poems, be sort of like little embedded florets, sort of kind of like fractals spiraling in on themselves that somehow sort of like made up the whole, but were still sort of worth within themselves. A lot of that came through the redrafting process, I think. wasn't sort of like initially my idea when I started, but sort of like started to come up as I was writing, and then sort of like I tried to structure it that way.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying, I think that what's interesting, your books are sort of thematically, the different ends of the spectrum to some degree, but that idea of, nesting or the florets, or having one piece, be emblematic of the whole, and that sort of telescoping form that you have going on in both your books, whether it's the individual presidential essay or the collection as a whole, or one poem versus the larger poem is something that really is interesting and spoke to us a lot about, just turning an idea, right? It didn't seem to have established thoughts on some of these things. Like you didn't come to some sort of resolution and then offer that resolution to us, but it's more of an involved act of processing. I know there's research involved on your side, Colin. Jesse, as poet, maybe there's a little bit more creative license there, but what is that task like as far as like the creative process is concerned?
Yeah, so for each project it's different, I guess. But for this one, I was working under Peter Streckfus at the time when I was writing this book. And he had told me that sort of when he was in grad school, one thing that he liked was that he could basically, he would have classes and he could basically put anything he wanted in front of people and they would have to respond to it. And sort of thinking about the writing process is doing those experiments and taking those risks. And so as I was sort of writing this book, I started sort of like mining, sort of just taking different scientific charts and stuff out of the libraries and sort of like appropriating those forms and deciding like, if I turn these into poems, like what will they look like and how will these people respond to them or in this workshop? And that's sort of like, I took the license, of course, sort of from the poems and had them sort of like embedded in it and made it work for the characters in the poems and stuff. But basically, I was just sort of like trying to experiment and see sort of what I could get away with in workshop and how people would respond to it.
Nice. And Colin, did that method sort of work? I know Jesse asked a sort of a similar question which is a great question about sort of the thematic elements per essay, but on a larger scale. Were you trying to like make sure you had like the frog and then the shark tooth and then did you have a collection of things that you wanted to get covered in there?
The kind of, I don't know, sometimes I think like you have to set, just to finish projects, you have to kind of set dumb goals for yourself. And so one of the very first version of the book, every essay, the word count was evenly divisible by the number of the president that it was about. And so, like Lyndon B. Johnson was the 36th president, and so the word count of the LBJ essay was evenly divisible by 36. And it was this kind of great little challenge thing that I could do that's not quite answering your question. And I have always been kind of forever grateful for you in suggesting like, maybe we can let this go in the next draft. But there were ideas that kind of emerged the more I wrote. There's, if the book has a refrain, it's the idea, there's a line that shows up in a couple essays about this job murders men. And that idea of just the absolute kind of physical strain that the presidency puts on the bodies of the people who do the job, that became a kind of way of thinking about this and turning it from the kind of big man idea of history into something that was more personal, maybe, or more human at least, and kind of pushing that idea forward a little bit in each essay became, as the collection grew, more of an idea and more of a goal, I think, for each essay.
Yeah, I wanted to actually address that notion of sort of persona or character, right? In the essays, I don't think at any point you actually step into the shoes and speak from an I perspective that I'm recalling. But Jesse's book, has the narrator and then the bird character, and Tiffany, she was here, has that's a multiple character narrator that she's the dual narrator. She's going back and forth in between and getting in the head of a mentally ill individual, or perhaps a mentally ill individual, and then a detective, and then sort of taking on these, wearing these shoes. To what extent, I guess, is that necessary? Even in writing nonfiction, it seems like it's pretty necessary, or poetry of your nature, which Colin said is sort of not narrative. So you're not telling technically a beginning to end story. I'll leave it there because I'm rambling. But Colin, if you wanted to pick up on that, and then maybe switch over to Jesse.
I show, like, the personal pronoun I shows up in a few essays in the book, but it's always me, right? It's always me, Colin Rafferty, as a kind of voice of the author or character of the author appearing in the piece. And it's interesting because one of the ideas behind the book is that the United States is a representative democracy, and so there's a way in which the president is me and I am him, kind of regardless of who the president is, and that maybe that kind of uncomfortable dynamic, or that too comfortable dynamic, played into the way I thought about maybe my own relationship with each president. I did an interview for a radio show a couple months ago, and one of the questions that they asked me was about that around the Nixon essay things kind of turned, and I was like, well, yeah, that's the first. That's because I'm sort of on the scene as a participant in history, and as a somebody living in history. And so that, I think, the creation of a persona and a voice exists throughout the book, but by the time it gets to late 20th century, it begins, I had a distinct sense that it was shifting, just because I had conscious memory of things, and because I was, rather than a researcher, was also a witness to some of these things. So that was a kind of a dual persona that emerged in the writing, that I really think kind of got developed in the revision process. This is also where I wish the Satellites of Oregon worked better, because you're right, Tiffany's got a dual narrator in M Theory, and it's absolutely kind of killer dynamic between the two. I'd love to hear about that. Lousy satellites.
Yeah, persona is something that sort of probably consumed my thought process for a little too long. It's not only individual persona, but sort of cultural persona has sort of maybe something I spend maybe too much time thinking about. You grow up thinking that you are who you are, and then you have this stable persona, and then there's very bright lines about who you are, and you have all this individual free will, and you get to make these choices, and you're doing these things because you are yourself. And then you really realize that this isn't really true, and that really everybody's really just made up of these multiple shifting personas. In one of my classes, we were reading Gloria Anzaldua's book, Borderlands, La Frontera, where she sort of starts to introduce this idea of all of these border personas that we have that sort of intermesh, and we shift from between them all the time. And I wanted to sort of use part of the book as a way to sort of try and understand sort of a past relationship that I had through a persona that I could create of myself, and sort of start to understand and try and process what had happened through sort of a persona that is like me, but not really me. So that I can use that, like I said, as a way to sort of start to think through the things that had happened.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think both your books do a great job of making, especially in maybe contemporary times, that you're both part and parcel of something, right? You're part of a larger collective history, or you're part of a relationship, but you might know about those things, but you are not actually that thing, which seems like a mistake that we tend to make a lot of days, that we assume or overly assume the identity of somebody or someone else that doesn't belong to us. And I think both of your books signal that, right? That you know about something, that doesn't mean you are that thing, right? You might even be a part of that thing, but not the collective whole, which is interesting. And again, go back to M theory, the way that she braids, the drama of that book, the societal influences working on, people in different positions and how they wrap around each other, and how they influence each other unknowingly is really quite amazing, right? But that kind of sort of leads in, and I think we can maybe end on this because it may be a little heavier than we wanted to get, because I know you all are both still writing and still working and still living in the world as we know it today. And I feel like we're in a very thick part of history right now. And as you're writing, how is it possible to maybe like ignore those things, or should you ignore those things, or how do you find yourself, writing in this day and age with all of the weight of the world?
I don't know. When the pandemic first sort of started, I remember thinking like that we were about to see a bunch of really terrible pandemic poems come out. Just because it feels to me like in a lot of ways, and like maybe we're past that now, but it feels to me like we haven't had as much time to process what has actually happened, to like actually emotionally and mentally process what has been happening the last couple of years. And I felt like a lot of poems that would come out of this would not have emotionally and mentally have processed sort of the real weight of this, and would just be imitations of sort of like earlier experiences that people had had and stuff like that. And so I don't think I've really written about the pandemic as much, or sort of like dealt with it as much, just because I feel like I need more time to mentally and emotionally process it.
I think for me, one of the things that I have done in the last 2 years, first I was just really grateful to be, up until publication, to be working on the revisions of the book and the editing of the book, just in large part because that let me be a writer without actually the burden of creating something brand new. I could still kind of feel like, oh yeah, I'm doing what I want to do and I'm doing my job here, but I don't have to like try to utilize my missing brain space to get something brand new on the page. Now that I'm in my third project, which my very academic description of the third book is that it's about the Vietnam War and public memory. It's been really interesting to kind of see the echoes of that time influencing now, even in terms of things like, a fragmented society and people kind of set at each other's throats in America, and the wind down of a disastrous war that went on much longer than I think anybody thought it was going to go on, and even now in kind of seeing territorial ambitions in the Ukraine, or in Ukraine, hearing those echoes of it again, and I think spending all that time kind of back in 1969 and 1970, as I have been for the research for the book, has made me think about 2022 a lot as another iteration of that time, right? I love what you said about, like, it feels like a very kind of thick moment in history where just everything is happening simultaneously. And it's a nice reminder in looking at that research that, like, well, we've been in places like this before. And it fragmented the country terribly, but we push on.
Awesome. Well, not awesome that we're all enduring that, but no, I just think it's interesting because, right, like, there's a compelled to document, but also compelled not to, exploit sort of simultaneously, and it's just interesting to hear writers discuss those things. And as Colin said, we will carry on through this, leave on a bright note. Thank you all for joining us. This is Baobab Press with Jesse DeLong and Colin Rafferty, and for a brief moment, Tiffany Cates there.
Everybody read M Theory.
Everybody read M Theory. Everybody read Execute the Office and Amateur Scientist Notebook. Like I said, they're available at your local independent bookstore and wherever you're buying your books. We have another event this Thursday at 3 Pacific and 6 Eastern, so check us out for that. And until then, thank you both for joining us, and we'll see you
Thanks,
later.
everyone. Thanks, Danilo. Thanks, Colin.